Siler's brow furrowed as the reports from the surface came in. The Brazkari, a race shrouded in mystery, had launched their invasion with a speed and ruthlessness that had caught even the most seasoned commanders off guard. 2 weeks ago, they had attacked the outer colonies without warning, moving like a predator stalking wounded prey. Now they were here. If Cirrus fell, the Council would have little hope of holding the remaining systems. The Brazkari were unlike anything Siler had ever faced. For years, they had posed as traitors, diplomats, harmless guests at the Council's grand galas. But the facade was shattered. They had learned Council tactics, studied their ships, and sabotaged key infrastructure. Every time Siler's forces engaged them, they seemed to know exactly how to respond, like a shadow always one step ahead. Siler inhaled deeply, glancing at the display before him. 500,000 soldiers, drawn from every corner of the galaxy, all under his command. It was the largest army the Council had assembled in centuries. Rows upon rows of state-of-the-art mechs, energy cannons, and automated drones filled the ship's storage bays. Victory seemed inevitable on paper. And yet Siler couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at the edges of his mind. The Brazkari hadn't run when they saw his fleet enter Cirrus's orbit. They hadn't scattered. They were waiting. "Sir," said his adjutant, Captain Vorel, interrupting his thoughts. "Surface recon teams are ready for deployment. They're standing by for your orders." Siler straightened. "Deploy them. I want full reports on enemy positions within the hour." Vorel nodded and moved to relay the command, but before he could, the door to the command deck slid open. Siler turned to see an officer from the Hantrixian contingent. Clad in traditional dark green armor that seemed out of place among the gleaming technological marvels of the Council's forces, Captain Ferric Tanis was a stark reminder of a past the Council had all but abandoned. The Hantrixians were warriors by blood, their methods seen as relics in an age dominated by plasma rifles and orbital strikes. They had been relegated to guard duties, viewed as little more than ceremonial figures by most in the upper echelons of command. Siler eyed the man warily. The Hantrixians had been allowed to send a contingent as a formality, but no one truly believed they would make a difference. After all, what could old-fashioned projectile weapons and physical endurance offer in a war against an enemy armed with far superior technology? "General Atrax," Tanis greeted him with a sharp salute. "We're ready to assist should you need it." Siler nodded curtly, his gaze lingering on the officer's battle-hardened features. "Your men will be stationed near the supply lines. I don't think we'll need to rely on ancient tactics just yet." Tanis didn't flinch at the dismissal. "As you wish, General." With a quick salute, Tanis left as quietly as he had entered. Siler returned his focus to the planetary display, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the Hantrixians. There was something about their unwavering calm that unsettled him. The Brazkari had overwhelmed every defense thrown at them so far, and Siler knew his army was not truly battle-tested. The Council had grown complacent after centuries of peace, relying on superior technology instead of honing the skills of its soldiers. As the first dropships descended into Cirrus's atmosphere, Siler pushed those thoughts aside. His battle plan was solid. His forces were numerous. Technology would win the day, as it always had. The minutes ticked by. Reports began to flow in from the surface. Initial landings were successful, no signs of immediate enemy resistance. Siler allowed himself a brief moment of relief. Maybe this would be simpler than he had feared. The Brazkari might be cunning, but they couldn't withstand a full-scale assault. And then, as if the universe itself was mocking his optimism, the alarms blared. A flood of red indicators lit up the display, each one marking an attack. Brazkari forces, far larger than anticipated, had emerged from hidden positions, ambushing the first wave of troops. Siler's stomach dropped. They had been baited. "Get me the ground commander!" Siler barked. But all that came through the comms was static. The Brazkari had cut off their communications. His hand clenched the armrest of his chair as the reality of the situation began to set in. His soldiers were walking into a massacre, just as so many others had before them. The enemy had anticipated every move. Siler's mind raced. He had planned for contingencies, but none accounted for an enemy this elusive. His army, his massive, technologically superior army, was failing. For the first time, he felt the cold grip of fear. He couldn't let this defeat be the end of Cirrus, nor the Council. There had to be another way. And then, in the back of his mind, a thought stirred. The Hantrixians. The ancient warriors he had dismissed earlier might be his only chance. Their methods, though primitive, were unpredictable. Perhaps that unpredictability was exactly what they needed. Siler's gaze shifted to where Captain Tanis had stood moments earlier. Could these warriors, forgotten by the Council, be the key to turning the tide? With renewed resolve he stood. Prepared to mobilize the Hantrixians, he ordered Vorel, his voice steady but urgent. The calm before the storm had ended. Now, the real battle would begin. The battlefield of Cirrus was a wasteland of smoldering craters and wreckage. Council soldiers, once proud and confident, were scattered, retreating under the relentless assault of the Brazkari. General Siler Atrax watched the carnage unfold on the holomap with growing despair. His forces were being systematically dismantled, their advanced armor and weapons useless against an enemy who thrived on chaos. The Brazkari weren't simply attacking, they were hunting. General! Captain Vorel's voice broke through the tension. We've lost contact with the southern defense line. Siler cut him off, his voice sharp. I know. He didn't need another report to confirm what was happening. His grand army, once a symbol of the Council's might, was crumbling before his eyes. The Brazkari had turned the planet into a killing field, and his soldiers had no idea how to fight back. Deploy the reserves to reinforce the eastern flank. We need to buy some time. But time was a luxury they didn't have. With every passing minute, the Brazkari's ambushes grew more precise, more devastating. Siler slammed his fist against the console, anger flaring within him. They were being outmaneuvered, outthought, outclassed. He had expected a conventional war, lines of battle, clear objectives. What he got instead was chaos. And in the midst of this chaos, one name echoed in his mind: Captain Ferric Tanis. Siler had dismissed the Hantrixian earlier, relegating his contingent to the fringes of the battlefield. Now, that decision felt like a mistake. The Hantrixians were warriors from another era, trained in tactics that the Council had long since abandoned. They had fought in wars where technology wasn't the answer, where survival depended on cunning, endurance, and grit. Siler straightened, his thoughts crystallizing into action. Get me Captain Tanis, he ordered, his voice firm. Vorel hesitated but complied, relaying the command. A few tense minutes later, Captain Ferric Tanis entered the command chamber. His presence was calm, steady, even as the world seemed to be falling apart around them. Siler studied the Hantrixian for a moment, searching for any hint of doubt or fear in his eyes. There was none. Captain, Siler began, keeping his tone professional. Your contingent is still at full strength, correct? Tanis nodded. We've sustained no major casualties. Siler stepped closer, his voice dropping. I need your help. The Brazkari have us cornered. Our tactics aren't working, they anticipate every move we make. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. I've come to realize that we're fighting a different kind of enemy. I want to hear your strategy. Tanis didn't gloat, didn't hesitate. He answered with the confidence of a man who had been waiting for this moment. The Brazkari are using guerrilla tactics, General. They rely on surprise and quick strikes, using the terrain to their advantage. Your soldiers are well trained, but they've been trained to fight in straight lines and coordinated assaults. That won't work here. Siler's frustration flared again. I know that. What do we do? Tanis stepped closer to the holomap, pointing to the dense forests and mountain passes surrounding the Brazkari positions. We fight them like they fight us. We take away their advantage by controlling the battlefield. My men are trained in trench warfare, ambushes, and artillery precision strikes. We can draw them out, force them into a fight on our terms. Siler's mind raced. Guerrilla warfare, trench fighting, these were relics from a bygone era, but now they sounded like salvation. He could see it, the shift in tactics that could level the playing field. The Hentrixians weren't bound by the same rigid protocols that had hobbled the Council's forces. They were adaptable, ruthless in their simplicity. "How long will you need to prepare?" Sylar asked. "An hour," Tanis replied. "We've already begun digging defensive positions near the eastern flank. We can turn the tide, but we need artillery support and your permission to execute." Sylar nodded without hesitation. "You have both." He turned to Vorel. "Coordinate with Captain Tanis. Send our remaining artillery to the eastern flank and pull back the retreating units. Let the Hentrixians take over the offensive." Vorel, who had watched the exchange in silence, now spoke up, his voice cautious. "General, are you sure? These tactics—" "I'm sure," Sylar snapped, his voice brooking no argument. "The Brazkari have beaten us at our own game. Now we fight them on their terms." Vorel saluted and hurried to carry out the orders. Sylar exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was his last gamble. If the Hentrixians failed, Cirrus would fall, and with it, any hope of turning the war around. The battle that followed was unlike anything the Council soldiers had ever seen. The Hentrixians moved with brutal efficiency, setting up ambushes and trench defenses in the rugged terrain of Cirrus. Where the Council's forces had struggled in open engagements, the Hentrixians thrived. They used the natural cover of the planet, burrowing deep into the ground and setting up sniper positions. Artillery shells rained down on the Brazkari forces, precise and deadly, turning their ambushes into routes. From the command center, Sylar watched as the tide shifted. The Brazkari, so confident in their ability to outmaneuver the Council's forces, were caught off guard by the ferocity of the Hentrixian counterattack. They had never faced an enemy who fought like this, an enemy who could disappear into the landscape, only to reappear with deadly accuracy. For the first time since the invasion began, the Brazkari were on the defensive. Sylar felt a surge of hope. He watched as the Brazkari lines broke, their formations collapsing under the relentless pressure. The Hentrixians, with their seemingly antiquated methods, had done what the Council's state-of-the-art army could not. But the battle was not yet won. As the Brazkari retreated, regrouping on the far side of the valley, Sylar knew they would strike again. The war was far from over, but for the first time, victory felt within reach. Sylar turned to Tanis, who had just returned from the front lines. "You were right," he said, offering the words like a reluctant admission. "We couldn't have done this without you." Tanis nodded, his expression unreadable. "This is only the beginning, General. The Brazkari won't give up easily. But we've shown them they're not invincible." Sylar met the captain's gaze, a newfound respect forming between them. The tide had turned, but the real test was still to come. The smoke of battle had begun to clear, leaving behind the stark reality of what had been won and lost. Cirrus, once teetering on the edge of collapse, now stood firm. The Brazkari, battered and beaten, had retreated into the dark reaches of space. But for General Sylar Atrax, the victory felt strangely hollow. He stood on the ridge overlooking the battlefield, watching the scattered movements of medics and soldiers tending to the wounded, his mind heavy with reflection. Captain Ferric Tanis approached, his armor streaked with mud and ash, but his stride steady as ever. The Hentrixian commander had been instrumental in turning the tide, his warriors proving what Sylar had once doubted, that the old ways had not only value, but strength. As Tanis drew closer, Sylar gestured to the battlefield below, his voice quiet. "You did what I couldn't," Sylar admitted. "I threw everything we had at them, technology, numbers, brute force, and they still overwhelmed us. But you, with fewer men and primitive weapons, brought them to their knees." Tanis nodded, his expression impassive, but there was a glint of something in his eyes, perhaps respect, or perhaps something deeper. "It wasn't about the weapons, General. It's never been about that. Wars are won in the heart and mind, not in the armory." Sylar turned to face him fully, the weight of the moment pressing in. "What do you mean?" Tanis's gaze drifted over the horizon as if he could still see the invisible lines of battle drawn across the landscape. The Brazkari were prepared to fight a war of machines. They knew your tactics, anticipated every move, because they think like you. They thrive on predictability, on precision. But when we disrupted their rhythm, when we made them fight on our terms, in the mud and the shadows, they faltered. They had never faced anything like it. Siler absorbed the words, feeling the uncomfortable truth settle into his chest. He had spent his entire career relying on the Council's vast technological superiority, trusting in its advanced tactics and strategies. The Council's armies were a well-oiled machine, efficient and deadly, but they had become rigid, inflexible. They had forgotten how to adapt. Your men, Siler said, his tone contemplative. The Hantrictians. They've been sidelined by the Council for years. I thought your methods were outdated, that your way of fighting belonged in the past. He shook his head slowly, the admission hard but necessary. I was wrong. Tanis inclined his head, acknowledging the shift in Siler's perspective without pressing the point. We don't fight for glory or accolades, General. We fight to survive. The Council forgot what that meant a long time ago. When you're up against an enemy that's faster, stronger, or more advanced, you have to be smarter. You have to be willing to get your hands dirty. Siler looked down at his own hands, clean and unmarked by the grit of battle. He had directed the war from the safety of the command center, relying on screens and data feeds to tell him where the fight was going. But Tanis had been in the trenches, shoulder to shoulder with his men, feeling the pulse of the battlefield in a way that no hologram could replicate. Is that what we've lost? Siler asked, almost to himself. The ability to fight with our hearts instead of our minds? Tanis's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice firm but not unkind. You've lost the ability to balance the two. Technology is a tool, nothing more. When it becomes a crutch, you stop seeing the world clearly. You stop understanding your enemy, and yourself. Siler's jaw tightened as the implications of Tanis's words sank in. The Council's reliance on technology had blinded them to the simpler truths of warfare, the raw elements that could turn the tide of any battle. Strength, strategy, and skill were important, but they were nothing without adaptability and the willingness to embrace the unknown. Captain, Siler said after a long pause, his voice resolute. The Council's forces need to change. We can't keep fighting this war the same way we always have. You and your men. I need you to teach us. Tanis's eyebrow lifted in surprise, though he didn't show it overtly. You're asking the Hantrictians to train the Council's armies? I'm asking you to save the Council, Siler replied, his tone sincere. What happened here on Sirius was a wake-up call. We barely survived, and the Brazkari aren't finished. They'll regroup, they'll come back. When they do, I want us to be ready, truly ready. For the first time, Tanis allowed a faint smile to cross his lips, though it was tempered by the weight of responsibility. We'll teach you, General. But it won't be easy. Your men have been trained to think one way for too long. Changing that will take time and patience. Siler nodded, his gaze hardening with determination. We'll make the time. If we don't, we won't survive the next attack. The two men stood in silence for a moment, each lost in his own thoughts. Around them, the remnants of the battle seemed to fade into the background as the future loomed large before them. There would be more bloodshed, more loss, but now, there was also hope. As the sun began to set over the war-torn landscape of Sirius, Siler knew that the battle had not just been a victory for the Hantrictians. It had been a lesson, one that he would carry with him as the Council prepared for the next inevitable confrontation. The galaxy had changed, and now, so too would the way they fought to protect it. Siler turned to Tanis one last time, extending his hand. Thank you, Captain, for everything. Tanis clasped Siler's forearm in a firm grip, the bond of warriors forged in fire. We'll be ready, General. When the time comes, we'll be ready. And with that, the future of the Council's defense was no longer one of technology alone, but of warriors who remembered what it meant to fight with heart, soul, and steel.